Good evening. I am Nolan Merrick, and this is a special in-depth report for Horn and Red Sea News. Thank you for joining us. On this channel, we move beyond the superficial headlines to provide independent, informed analysis of the Horn of Africa and the vital Red Sea corridor. This region is the pulse of global maritime trade and a crucible of geopolitical competition. Before we begin our deep dive, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Tonight, we analyze a profound geopolitical anomaly, a state that possesses every functional attribute of sovereignty, yet remains a ghost on the international stage. Imagine a territory with a clearly defined border, a permanent population of over 5 million people, and a government that exercises effective control over its land. It maintains a disciplined military, issues its own currency, and oversees a biometric voting system that international observers frequently describe as more transparent than those in many recognized nations. Yet, in the eyes of the United Nations and the African Union, this entity does not exist as a sovereign state. Tonight, we explore the legal, historical, and strategic layers of the Somaliland paradox, the reality on the ground. Since declaring its independence from the collapsed Somali Republic in May 1991, Somaliland has operated as a self-governing entity. To understand the irony of this situation, one must look at the timeline. Somaliland has now been self-governing for 34 years. This is significantly longer than the 30 years it spent in a troubled union with the South. We live in an era where the international community spends billions of dollars on state-building projects in fragile regions. Yet, Somaliland represents a successful state-built project that happened almost entirely through local initiative. While the federal government of Somalia in Mogadishu has required massive infusions of foreign aid and the protection of African Union peacekeepers to maintain a foothold, Somaliland has secured its own territory and developed its own institutions with virtually no external military or financial support. In the capital of Hargeisa, the evidence of statehood is not theoretical, it is functional. There is a civil service that collects taxes, a judiciary that adjudicates disputes, and a police force that maintains a level of public safety that is rare in the region. Most remarkably, Somaliland has pioneered a hybrid governance model that blends Western democratic structures with traditional African conflict resolution mechanisms. By institutionalizing the role of clan elders in the Gorti, or upper house of parliament, they have created a culturally resonant system that has facilitated multiple peaceful transfers of executive power. The historical union and its dissolution. To evaluate Somaliland's claim objectively, we must move past the word secession and look at the actual historical and legal records. Somaliland's argument is rooted in the dissolution of a failed voluntary union between two distinct colonial entities. On June 26, 1960, the British Somaliland Protectorate gained its independence. It was a sovereign state for 5 days, receiving telegrams of congratulations from the United States and the United Kingdom. On July 1, 1960, it entered into a voluntary union with the newly independent Italian Somaliland to form the Somali Republic. However, this was never a union of equals. The North was quickly marginalized politically and economically. By the 1980s, the relationship had turned from marginalization to active state-sponsored violence. Under the regime of Siad Barre, the Somali National Army launched a scorched earth campaign against the North. This period, including the 1988 aerial bombardment of Hargeisa, resulted in tens of thousands of civilian deaths and the displacement of hundreds of thousands. Human rights organizations and legal historians now formally recognize this as the Isaac Genocide. When the central government in Mogadishu collapsed in 1991, the people of the North gathered in the city of Burao. They did not vote to break away in the traditional sense. They voted to nullify the 1960 Act of Union, asserting that because the union had resulted in genocide and state collapse, they were legally returning to their original 1960 status as an independent state. The legal impasse and the African Union. The central paradox is that while Somaliland meets every objective criterion for statehood, it remains blocked by a single diplomatic principle, the sanctity of colonial borders. The African Union is governed by the principle of uti possidetis juris, which mandates that the borders inherited at the time of independence from colonial powers must remain unchanged. The fear among African heads of state is that recognizing Somaliland would open a Pandora's box, encouraging separatist movements from the Casamance in Senegal to the Tigray in Ethiopia. However, the irony here is that Somaliland is actually the only entity in the region advocating for the restoration of a colonial border. Because they were a British protectorate and the South was an Italian colony, their border is not a new invention. It is the original 1884 boundary. By recognizing Somaliland, the AU would actually be upholding its own principle of colonial-era borders. Furthermore, international law is inconsistent in its application of territorial integrity versus self-determination. In the case of Kosovo, the West recognized independence based on remedial secession, the idea that a state loses its right to govern a people if it commits mass atrocities against them. If this standard were applied to the survivors of the 1988 bombardment, the legal case for Somaliland would be indisputable. Because this is the Horn of Africa and not the Balkans, the international community continues to insist on a one Somalia policy that exists only on paper. The Montevideo Criteria and global hypocrisy. Under the 1933 Montevideo Convention, the legal requirements for a state are a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Somaliland meets these criteria more effectively than several current UN member states. For instance, Somaliland maintains better control over its territory than the recognized government in Mogadishu, which has spent years struggling to secure its own capital. The global hypocrisy is most visible in how world powers interact with Hargeisa. The United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union all engage with Somaliland as a de facto state. They coordinate on counterterrorism, they cooperate on maritime security to protect the Red Sea shipping lanes, and they provide development aid. Yet here, they refuse to grant de jure recognition. They treat Somaliland as a strategic partner in private, but as a non-entity in public to avoid diplomatic friction with the federal government of Somalia. This has created a bizarre diplomatic side-chick dynamic where the world wants the benefits of Somaliland's stability without the responsibility of recognizing its sovereignty. The geopolitics of the Red Sea. The final layer of the paradox is economic and strategic. Somaliland sits on the southern shore of the Gulf of Aden, a corridor through which nearly 12% of global trade passes every day. The port of Berbera has recently become a focal point of great power competition. With hundreds of millions of dollars in investment from DP World, Berbera is being transformed into a world-class maritime hub. For landlocked Ethiopia, a nation of 120 million people, Berbera is a vital lifeline to the sea. However, because Somaliland is unrecognized, it cannot access the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. It cannot secure sovereign loans to build the roads and electricity grids its people need. Its youth, who are largely English-speaking and technologically literate, are hindered by a passport that many countries refuse to accept. This lack of recognition is not just a diplomatic inconvenience, it is an economic ceiling. It forces Somaliland to operate with one hand tied behind its back, while it simultaneously acts as a bulwark against the regional threats of piracy and extremism. Conclusion: the inconvenient truth. Somaliland represents an inconvenient truth for the international community. It is a testament to what a people can achieve through sheer will and local consensus. It proves that a nation is not merely a line on a map drawn by a diplomat in 19th century Europe, but a lived reality of peace and governance. The world continues to prioritize diplomatic protocol over objective facts. But as the Red Sea corridor becomes increasingly central to global security, the ghost nation of the Horn will only become harder to ignore. I'm Nolan Merrick. This has been a special report for Horn and Red Sea News. If you found this deep dive analysis valuable, please share this video. Your engagement helps us bring these critical regional stories to a global audience. Subscribe for more informed, independent analysis of the Horn and the Red Sea. Stay sharp and keep your eyes on the horizon. I'll see you in the next briefing.